The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty general store, and Martha Delaney pressed her gloved hand against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. Through the smeared glass, she could see a tall man standing beside a weathered hitching post, his hat pulled low against the harsh Arizona sun that beat down on quartzsite in the summer of 1882. This was the man she had come all the way from Philadelphia to marry, a stranger whose letters had promised her safety and a home, though she had never been able to write back in her own words. The driver opened the door and offered his hand, which Martha took gratefully. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the packed dirt of the main street, and dust swirled around her dark traveling dress. The man by the hitching post straightened, and Martha got her first real look at Xavier Preston. He was perhaps 28, with sun-darkened skin and lines around his eyes that spoke of long days squinting across open range. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn work shirt, and his hands looked strong and capable. When he removed his hat, his brown hair was damp with sweat, and his expression was cautious but not unkind. "Miss Delaney." His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling down a creek bed. Martha nodded, her throat tight. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times during the long journey west, rehearsed the gestures she would need to make him understand. She pressed her hand to her chest and nodded again, then touched her lips and shook her head slowly. Xavier's brow furrowed. "I do not understand, miss." She repeated the gesture, more deliberately this time. Hand to chest nod, fingers to lips shake of head. Her eyes pleaded with him to comprehend what she could not say. "Are you saying you cannot speak?" Xavier asked, his voice softer now. Relief flooded through Martha, and she nodded vigorously. She pulled a small slate and piece of chalk from her traveling bag, the items she had carried since childhood. With careful letters she wrote, "I am mute. I was born this way. I hope you will still honor our agreement." Xavier took the slate and read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed the words. When he looked up at her, Martha braced herself for rejection, for anger, for the kind of disappointment she had seen so many times before. Men wanted wives who could call them in for supper, who could gossip with neighbors, who could sing lullabies to children. What use was a woman who could make no sound at all? But Xavier simply handed back the slate and picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "I reckon we have some talking to do, though I suppose I will be doing most of it. Come on. The ranch is about an hour's ride from here." Martha stood frozen for a moment, uncertain whether this meant acceptance or merely postponement of the inevitable. Xavier glanced back at her, and something in his expression gentled. "Miss Delaney, I am a man of my word. I asked for a wife, and you came all this way to be one. That takes more courage than most folks have. Your silence does not change that you are here, and it does not change that I need help on my ranch. We will figure out the rest as we go." The tightness in Martha's chest eased slightly. She nodded and followed him to where a wagon waited, loaded with supplies from the general store. Xavier helped her up onto the seat with surprising care, making sure her skirts were clear before he climbed up beside her. He clicked his tongue at the two horses, and they started forward at a steady pace. Quartzsite was not much of a town, just a scattering of buildings along the road that led deeper into the Arizona territory. Martha could see the desert stretching out in all directions, punctuated by strange cacti and scrub brush that looked nothing like the green forest she had left behind. The heat was oppressive, making her woolen dress feel like a furnace, and the sun was so bright it hurt her eyes even through her bonnet. "It is different out here," Xavier said, as if reading her thoughts. "Take some getting used to. The ranch is up in the foothills, so it is a bit cooler there, and we have a good well. I run about 200 head of cattle with help from 2 ranch hands, Tom and Miguel. They are good men, and they will treat you with respect or answer to me." Martha listened to the sound of his voice, finding it oddly comforting. He did not seem to mind that she could not respond, did not demand answers to questions she could not give. He simply talked, filling the silence with information about the land, the livestock, the challenges of ranching in the desert. "I lost my mother 3 years back," Xavier continued after a while. "She helped me run the place after my father died. I have been managing alone since then, but it is hard. The house needs a woman's touch, and I am not much of a cook. I burn everything I try to make except coffee and beans." Martha wrote on her slate, "I can cook and clean and mend." Xavier glanced at the slate and nodded. "That is good, real good." "I am not expecting perfection, Miss Delaney. I am just hoping for partnership." The word settled into Martha's heart like a seed finding soil. Partnership. Not servitude, not charity, but partnership. It was more than she had dared to hope for. The ranch appeared gradually, first as a dark smudge against the foothills, then resolving into a low adobe house with a wooden barn and several outbuildings. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze, and Martha could see cattle dotting the hillsides beyond. It was modest but well maintained, and there was something appealing about its solidity against the vast openness of the land. Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Martha. His hands on her waist were firm but brief, setting her down quickly and stepping back as if worried about impropriety. "I will show you the house," he said. "You will have the bedroom. I will bunk with the hands in the barn until we are properly married." Martha had not expected such consideration. In her slate she wrote, "When will we marry?" "I figured we would give it a week or so," Xavier said, reading over her shoulder. "Let you get settled, make sure this is truly what you want. Give us both time to be certain. Is that acceptable?" Martha nodded, grateful for the reprieve. She had been prepared to marry a stranger immediately, but the chance to know him first was a gift she had not anticipated. The inside of the house was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the burning sun. The main room held a large fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and a few simple furnishings. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and Martha could see dishes piled in a dry sink, waiting to be washed. A doorway led to what must be the bedroom, and another opened onto what looked like a small pantry. "It is not much," Xavier said, sounding almost apologetic. "But it is sturdy, and the roof does not leak." Martha set down her bag and immediately went to the dry sink, examining the situation. Xavier had not been exaggerating about his domestic skills. The dishes were crusted with old food, and she could see mouse droppings on the counter. But these were problems with solutions, tasks she could complete with her own 2 hands. She turned to Xavier and gave him a smile, the first real one since she had arrived. Something shifted in his expression when she smiled, a softening around his eyes. "You are not upset about the mess?" She shook her head and wrote, "I have cleaned worse. I will have this house proper in no time." "I believe you will," Xavier said, and there was respect in his voice. "I need to go check on the cattle before dark. You settle in and make yourself at home. There is a pump out back for water, and the pantry has some supplies. If you can manage something for supper, that would be mighty fine, but do not feel obligated. You have had a long journey." Martha nodded and watched him leave, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. When the door closed behind him, she stood alone in the center of the room and let herself take a full breath. She had made it. She was here, in the Arizona territory, in a home that might become hers, with a man who had not turned her away despite her disability. The relief was so intense it made her knees weak, but Martha did not let herself rest. She tied a cloth around her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. The dishes came first, requiring several trips to the pump to fetch water. She heated it over the fireplace and scrubbed until her hands were red and wrinkled. Then she swept the floors, cleared away the mouse droppings, and wiped down every surface she could reach. In the pantry, she found flour, lard, salt, a few withered potatoes, and a slab of salt pork. It was not much to work with, but Martha had learned to be resourceful during the lean years after her father died. She made biscuits from the flour and lard, boiled the potatoes, and fried slices of the salt pork until they were crispy. By the time Xavier returned with 2 other men as the sun was setting, the house smelled of cooking food and the table was set with clean plates. Xavier stopped in the doorway, staring. The 2 men behind him, one older with gray in his beard and one younger with dark skin and hair, looked equally surprised. "Miss Delaney, this is Tom and Miguel," Xavier said, gesturing to the men. "Men, this is my intended, Martha Delaney, who came all the way from Philadelphia." "Pleased to meet you, miss," Tom said, removing his hat. Miguel nodded respectfully. Martha dipped her head in acknowledgement and gestured to the table, inviting them to sit. She served the simple meal, watching their faces as they ate. All 3 men looked starved and they cleaned their plates in minutes. "Miss Delaney, this is the best meal I have had in months," Tom said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You are a miracle worker." Martha blushed and wrote on her slate, "It was just simple food." Xavier read it aloud for the others and shook his head. "Simple or not, it is more than we have been managing. We are grateful." After the men left to return to the barn, Martha cleaned up the dishes while Xavier sat at the table watching her work. She was conscious of his gaze, wondering what he was thinking, whether he was having second thoughts. "You do not have to do all this in one day," Xavier said finally. "You must be exhausted from your travels." Martha turned and wrote, "Keeping busy helps me not to worry." "What are you worried about?" She hesitated, then wrote carefully, "That you will change your mind about marrying me." Xavier stood up and crossed to where she stood by the dry sink. He was close enough that she could smell the dust and sweat on him, mixed with something else, something that was just him. "Miss Delaney, I am not going to change my mind. You have already proven yourself to be resourceful, hardworking, and kind. Those are the qualities that matter on a ranch. The fact that you cannot speak does not change any of that." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She had spent her whole life being told she was less than, being passed over, being pitied or mocked. To have this man, this stranger, look at her and see value was almost more than she could bear. "Now you go on to bed," Xavier said gently. "I put fresh linens on for you this morning. Sleep as late as you need. Tomorrow will be time enough to start figuring out how we are going to make this partnership work." That night, lying in the narrow bed in the small bedroom, Martha stared at the ceiling and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled. The wind whispered through the eaves. And for the first time in years, Martha felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, Martha woke before dawn, dressed quickly, and set about making breakfast. She found eggs in the pantry, carefully preserved in a crock of lard and more of the salt pork. By the time Xavier and the ranch hands came in from morning chores, she had hot coffee, scrambled eggs, biscuits, and fried pork waiting on the table. Xavier stopped and stared again, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. "You are going to spoil us," he said, but he was smiling. Over the next few days, Martha settled into a routine. She woke early, made breakfast, cleaned the house, prepared lunch, tended a small vegetable garden she found behind the house, and made supper. In between, she explored the ranch, learning the layout, meeting the animals, and beginning to understand the rhythm of life in this harsh but beautiful place. Xavier was often gone during the day, working with the cattle or mending fences, but in the evenings, he would sit with her at the table and talk. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about coming to Arizona with his parents to start fresh, about the challenges of building a ranch from nothing. Martha listened and occasionally wrote responses on her slate, which Xavier read with careful attention. On the 5th day, Xavier came in for lunch looking troubled. Martha served him stew made from a jackrabbit Miguel had shot that morning, then sat down across from him with her slate. "I need to talk to you about something," Xavier said, pushing his food around his plate. "There is a problem I have been putting off dealing with, but I cannot avoid it any longer." Martha wrote, "What problem?" "There is a man named Cyrus Kane who owns the ranch to the north. He has been trying to buy my land for 2 years now, and he is not the kind of man who takes no for an answer. He has been making threats, subtle ones, but threats all the same. I wanted you to know in case anything happens." Martha's stomach tightened with fear. She wrote, "What kind of threats?" "He says accidents happen on ranches. Fences get cut, cattle wander off, wells get poisoned. So far it has just been talk, but I worry he might try something more direct now that he knows I am not selling." "Why does he want your land?" "There is a spring on my property, one of the best sources of water for miles around. With that spring, he could expand his operation significantly. Without it, he is limited. But this is my land, my family's land, and I will not give it up." Martha reached across the table and touched Xavier's hand briefly, a gesture of support. He looked up at her, and something warm passed between them. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It helps, not facing this alone." That afternoon, Martha was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard horses approaching. She peered around the corner and saw 4 men riding into the yard, led by a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and expensive-looking clothes. Xavier came out of the barn, and Martha could see the tension in his shoulders. "Kane," Xavier said, his voice flat. "What brings you here?" "Heard you got yourself a bride, Preston," Kane said, leaning forward in his saddle. "Thought I would come by and offer my congratulations." "Your congratulations are noted. Now you can leave." "Not very friendly, are you?" Kane's gaze swept the yard and landed on Martha, who had frozen beside the laundry line. "That her? My personal life is none of your concern." "Everything on this property is my concern, Preston, because it is all going to be mine sooner or later. You might as well accept that now and save yourself some trouble." Xavier's hand moved toward the gun on his hip. "I've told you 100 times I am not selling. Now get off my land." Kane laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are making a mistake, Preston, especially now that you have a woman to protect. Women are delicate creatures. They need safety, security. You cannot provide that here, not with the kind of trouble that is coming your way." Martha felt a flash of anger cut through her fear. She stepped out from behind the laundry line and walked toward the men, her chin raised. Xavier made a gesture for her to go back, but she ignored him. She stopped beside Xavier and took his hand, squeezing it firmly, making her position clear. She was with him whatever came. Kane's eyes narrowed. Well, got some spirit in her, does she? That is good, she will need it." "Leave," Xavier said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." Kane studied them for a long moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself, but do not say I did not warn you." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed him back down the dusty road. When they were gone, Xavier turned to Martha, his expression torn between gratitude and concern. "You should not have come out here. Kane is a dangerous man." Martha wrote on her slate, which she had carried with her, "I am your partner. I stand with you." Xavier read the words, and something fierce and tender came into his eyes. "Your silence speaks louder than any words," he said softly. "You showed Kane that we are united, that he cannot intimidate us." "That took courage." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest. She wrote, "When will we marry? Are you certain? After seeing what you might be facing here, I would understand if you wanted to reconsider." She wrote firmly, "I am certain." "Then we will ride into town tomorrow and find the preacher. If that is what you truly want." Martha nodded. It was what she wanted more than anything. In just a few days, Xavier had shown her more respect and kindness than she had known in years. He looked at her and saw a person, not a disability. He valued her silence, found meaning in it rather than lack. She could build a life with a man like that. The next morning they dressed in their best clothes and rode into Quartzsite in the wagon. Martha wore a blue dress she had made herself, and Xavier had brushed his dark suit until it was nearly free of dust. Tom and Miguel came along as witnesses, both of them scrubbed clean and grinning. The preacher was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who looked startled when Xavier explained that his bride could not speak. "Is she simple?" he asked, not unkindly. "She is mute," Xavier said sharply, "which has nothing to do with her mind. She understands everything perfectly well." "Can she consent to the marriage?" Martha wrote on her slate. "Yes, I consent freely and with joy." The preacher read it and nodded. "Very well then. Let us begin." The ceremony was simple and brief. Martha could not speak her vows aloud, but she wrote them carefully on her slate, and the preacher accepted that. When he pronounced them man and wife, Xavier lifted her hand and kissed it gently, his eyes never leaving her face. It was not the kiss she had expected, not the perfunctory peck of obligation, but something tender and full of promise. They celebrated with a meal at the small restaurant in town, where the proprietor made a fuss over them and gave them extra pie. Tom and Miguel toasted them with coffee, and even the other patrons offered congratulations. Martha felt overwhelmed by the warmth of it all, the sense of community in this rough little town. On the ride back to the ranch, Xavier was quieter than usual. Martha wondered if he was regretting his decision now that it was done, now that they were truly bound together. But when they reached the house and he helped her down from the wagon, he held her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "I know this was sudden," he said. "And I know we barely know each other. But I want you to know that I will do my best to be a good husband to you, Martha. You deserve that." Martha touched his face, letting her fingers trace the rough line of his jaw. Then she stood on her toes and kissed him, brief but deliberate, a promise of her own. That night, they shared the bedroom for the first time as husband and wife. Xavier was gentle and patient, understanding when Martha needed to write on her slate to communicate, never making her feel awkward or inadequate. In the darkness, with his arms around her, Martha felt truly safe for the first time since her mother died. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and growing intimacy. Martha learned to read Xavier's moods, to understand what he needed before he asked. She developed a system of gestures and expressions that Tom and Miguel learned to interpret, and they began to treat her like a treasured sister. The house transformed under her care, becoming not just clean but welcoming. With curtains she sewed from fabric, Xavier bought in town, and flowers she planted around the door. But the threat of Cain hung over everything like a storm cloud on the horizon. Twice more he came to the ranch, making veiled threats and offering money for the land. Each time Xavier refused, and each time Cain left with promises that he would be back. Then one morning, Tom came running into the house, his face pale. "Boss, you need to come quick. The cattle in the north pasture, they are sick. Something is wrong with the water." Xavier and Martha ran to the pasture and found a dozen head of cattle lying on their sides, breathing hard, foam around their mouths. The small creek that ran through the pasture had a strange oily sheen on its surface. "Someone poisoned it," Xavier said, his voice shaking with fury. Kane, it had to be Kane. Martha grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading with him not to do anything rash. She wrote, "Go to the law. Let them handle it." The nearest law is 2 days' ride away, and by the time they got here, there would be no proof. Kane knows that. Martha wrote urgently, "Then we gather proof. We watch and wait and catch him." Xavier stared at her slate, then nodded slowly. "You are right. Going after him in anger will only play into his hands. We need to be smart about this." They spent the rest of the day trying to save what cattle they could and fencing off the poisoned creek. Miguel rode into town to send a telegram to the territorial marshal, while Tom kept watch for any sign of Kane or his men. Martha worked alongside Xavier, helping with the sick animals, holding their heads while he dosed them with remedies, offering silent support. That evening they collapsed at the kitchen table, exhausted and covered in dirt. Martha made coffee and sat down beside Xavier, taking his hand. "I do not know what I would do without you," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are the strongest person I know, Martha. The way you face everything, never complaining, always finding a way forward. I am grateful for you every single day." Martha felt tears well up in her eyes. She wrote, "I love you." Xavier stared at the words for a long moment, then looked up at her face. "You do," she nodded, her heart pounding. "I love you too," he said, and his voice was full of wonder. "I think I started falling for you the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and refused to let your silence be a weakness. You turned it into a strength, and you have been teaching me to do the same with my own struggles." He pulled her close and kissed her deeply, and Martha kissed him back with all the feeling she could not voice. They sat there in the fading light, holding each other, and Martha thought that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. 2 nights later, Tom woke them with urgent knocking. "Boss, there are riders approaching, at least 6 of them." Xavier grabbed his rifle and ran outside with Martha close behind despite his protests. She could see torches bobbing in the darkness, coming up the road toward the house. "Preston." Kane's voice boomed across the night. "Time to stop playing games. Sign over your land or we will burn you out. You are threatening to burn down a man's house with his wife inside," Xavier called back. "That is murder, Kane. Even you cannot get away with that. Who is going to prove anything? We are just passing by and there was a tragic accident. These desert fires, they spread so fast." Martha ran back into the house and grabbed her slate. She wrote quickly and showed it to Xavier. "The marshal. Tell him the marshal is coming." Xavier nodded and shouted, "The territorial marshal is already on his way here, Kane. Miguel sent for him days ago. You do anything now and you will hang for it." There was a long silence. Then Kane called back, "You are bluffing." "Am I? Are you willing to risk your neck to find out?" More silence. Martha held her breath, praying Kane would believe the lie. Finally, she heard Kane curse and the sound of horses moving. "This is not over, Preston, not by a long shot." The torches withdrew into the darkness, and slowly the sound of hoofbeats faded away. Xavier lowered his rifle, his hands shaking with the aftershock of fear. "That was brilliant," he said to Martha, "buying us time. But what do we do now? Miguel did send for the marshal, but he might not come for weeks, if at all, and Kane will figure out we were bluffing soon enough." Martha thought hard, then wrote, "We need help. Other ranchers, safety in numbers." Xavier read it and nodded slowly. "You are right. There are 4 other small ranchers within a day's ride. We have helped each other before. If we all stand together, Kane cannot pick us off one by one." Over the next week, Xavier visited each of the neighboring ranches, explaining what had happened and asking for their support. To Martha's relief, every single one agreed to help. They set up a system where the ranchers would take turns posting guards and would come running if anyone fired warning shots or lit signal fires. Martha wrote a detailed account of everything Cain had done, complete with dates and witnesses. Xavier took it to the newspaper office in Quartzsite, and the editor agreed to publish it. 2 days later, the story ran on the front page, and suddenly the whole territory was talking about Cyrus Cain and his attempts to steal land from honest ranchers. The pressure of public opinion did what the threat of law could not. Cain found his cattle sales drying up, his credit at the bank being questioned, his reputation in tatters. Within a month, he left Arizona Territory entirely, heading to California where his name was not yet known. With the threat gone, life on the ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm. Martha and Xavier worked side by side every day, their partnership deepening into something rich and lasting. Martha had never been happier. She had found a place where her silence was not seen as a failing, but simply as part of who she was, where she was valued for her actions rather than her words. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple, Xavier took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future, about what we want to build here. I would like to expand the ranch, maybe get some horses in addition to the cattle, and I would like to start a family if that is something you want too." Martha had been hoping he would say something like this. She wrote, "I want that very much." "You will be a wonderful mother," Xavier said, squeezing her hand. "You have so much love to give, and I have seen how gentle you are with the animals, how patient. Our children will be lucky to have you." By the spring of 1883, Martha was pregnant. She had been worried about how she would manage, how she would communicate with a child who needed to hear their mother's voice. But Xavier assured her that children learned to understand what was important, and that their child would know they were loved regardless of whether Martha could speak. Tom and Miguel were thrilled with the news, already making plans to build a larger bedroom onto the house and carving toys for the baby. The neighboring ranchers' wives came to visit, bringing advice and baby clothes and offering to help when the time came. Martha's pregnancy was not easy. The desert heat made her sick, and she struggled with exhaustion. But Xavier was attentive and caring, taking over many of her chores and making sure she rested. On the difficult days, he would sit with her and read aloud from books they had ordered from back east, filling the silence with stories and poetry. In December, as winter brought cooler temperatures to the Arizona desert, Martha went into labor. Xavier sent Miguel racing to fetch the doctor from Quartzsite while Tom stayed to help. The labor was long and painful, and there were moments when Martha was afraid, but Xavier never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, and whispered encouragement even though she could not respond. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with strong lungs and Xavier's dark hair, Martha wept with relief and joy. Xavier held his son with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. "He is perfect," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Martha had thought about this for months. She wrote, "Samuel, after your father." Xavier looked up at her, tears in his eyes. "Samuel Preston, that is a fine name, a strong name." He brought the baby to Martha and placed him carefully in her arms. "Look at what we made together. Look at what love can create." Martha gazed down at her son, at his tiny fingers curled into fists, at the way his eyes tried to focus on her face. She had been afraid that not being able to sing lullabies or coo at him would make her less of a mother, but as she held him, she knew that was not true. Love did not require words. It required presence, attention, care, and those she could give in abundance. As Samuel grew, Martha's fears proved unfounded. He learned to understand her gestures and expressions just as the ranch hands had. When he was fussy, she would rock him and hum, a sound she could make even though she could not form words. The vibration in her chest seemed to soothe him just as well as any song. Xavier would sit with them in the evenings, reading stories aloud while Martha nursed the baby, creating a family unit that felt complete. The ranch prospered over the next few years. With Cain gone, other small ranchers flourished too, and they formed a cooperative that gave them better prices for their cattle. Xavier did buy horses as he had planned, beautiful quarter horses that he trained for ranch work and sold to other outfits across the territory. Martha managed the household and the accounts, her neat handwriting filling ledger after ledger with records of their growing success. Samuel was 2 when Martha became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, as if her body remembered what to do. In the spring of 1886, she gave birth to a daughter with Martha's blonde hair and Xavier's brown eyes. They named her Rose, after Martha's mother, and Samuel was enchanted with his little sister from the first moment he saw her. Martha often thought back to that day she had stepped off the stagecoach in Quartzsite, terrified and uncertain, wondering if Xavier would reject her once he learned she could not speak. She remembered the way he had looked at her and said her silence did not change what mattered. How right he had been, and how grateful she was that he had seen past her disability to the person beneath. One evening, when Samuel was 5 and Rose was 3, the family sat together on the porch watching the stars come out. The children were playing with the wooden horses Miguel had carved for them, and Xavier had his arm around Martha's shoulders. "You ever miss Philadelphia?" Xavier asked. "The city, the convenience, the society." Martha shook her head firmly and wrote on the slate she still carried, "This is home. You are my home." "I feel the same," Xavier said. "You made this house a home, Martha. Before you came, it was just a place I lived, a roof over my head while I worked, but you brought warmth and love and purpose. You gave me a reason to build something lasting." Samuel looked up from his playing. "Pa, tell us again about the day you met Ma," Xavier grinned. "You have heard that story 100 times, son, but I like it. Tell it again." So Xavier told the story of how Martha had stepped off the stagecoach in her dark traveling dress, how she had shown him with simple gestures that she could not speak, how he had loaded her trunk and taken her to the ranch. He told about the first meal she had cooked and the way she had transformed the dusty, neglected house into a real home. "I knew right away your ma was special," Xavier said, squeezing Martha's shoulder. "She did not let anything stop her. She faced down Cyrus Cain, helped build this ranch, raised you children with more love and patience than any person I have ever known. She showed me that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes silence speaks louder than any words." Rose climbed into Martha's lap and touched her face. "I love you, Mama," she said. Martha kissed her daughter's forehead and hugged her close, her eyes shining with tears. She could not say the words back, but Rose knew. Rose had always known, just as Samuel did, just as Xavier did. Love did not need voice. It needed action, presence, devotion. And those Martha had given freely every day since she arrived in Arizona. As the years passed, the ranch continued to grow. Tom eventually married a widow from Quartzsite and built a house on the property, bringing his new family into their extended circle. Miguel saved his wages and bought a small piece of land adjacent to Xavier's, starting his own modest ranch with Xavier's help and support. The children grew strong and confident, learning to read the desert the way some children read books. Samuel proved to have his father's skill with horses and his mother's quiet determination. By the time he was 12, he could break and train horses as well as any grown man. Rose was gentler. Drawn to the garden, Martha had expanded over the years, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the harsh desert soil through careful attention and hard work. Martha taught both children to read and write, using the slate that had been her constant companion since childhood. She showed them how to observe, how to listen, how to communicate without words when words failed. Xavier taught them to ride and rope, to mend fences and tend cattle, to be honest and brave and kind. In 1891, when Samuel was 8 and Rose was 6, tragedy struck the neighboring ranch. The Henderson family lost their barn to fire, along with most of their winter feed. Without hesitation, Xavier and Martha organized the community to help. Every rancher contributed hay and money, and the men gathered to build a new barn. Martha coordinated the effort, writing lists and schedules, making sure everyone had food and supplies. Within 2 weeks, the Hendersons had a new barn and enough feed to last the winter. "I do not know how to thank you," Mrs. Henderson said to Martha, tears streaming down her face. "You have saved us." Martha wrote, "We are neighbors. We help each other. That is what community means." Mrs. Henderson read the words and hugged Martha tightly. "You are a remarkable woman, Martha Preston, an inspiration to all of us." Martha was not sure about being an inspiration, but she knew she had found her purpose in this harsh, beautiful land. She had come west as a frightened young woman with a disability that made her an outsider in polite society, and she had found a place where she belonged, where her silence was not a barrier, but simply a different way of being. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Martha by taking her into quartzsite for a special occasion. The town had grown substantially in the past decade, now boasting a proper church, a school, and several new businesses. Xavier led her to the church, where she found all their friends and neighbors gathered. "I wanted everyone to be here," Xavier explained, "because I wanted to publicly renew our vows and tell the world how grateful I am that you are my wife." The preacher, the same man who had married them a decade before, smiled at them. "Xavier has asked to say a few words before we begin." Xavier took Martha's hands and looked into her eyes. 10 years ago, I sent for a mail-order bride because I needed help running this ranch. I thought I was looking for a cook and housekeeper, someone to share the workload. But what I got was so much more than that. I got a partner, a friend, a lover, a mother to my children. I got a woman who showed me that courage is not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about standing firm in who you are regardless of what others think. Martha, your silence speaks louder than any words ever could. It speaks of strength and determination and love that does not need fancy speeches to be real. I am honored to be your husband, and I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of you." Martha was crying now, happy tears that she did not try to hide. She wrote on her slate, her hand shaking, "I am the lucky one. You saw me when others only saw my disability. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. I love you more than I can ever express." Xavier read her words aloud so everyone could hear, and there was not a dry eye in the church. They renewed their vows with the whole community as witness, and afterward there was a celebration with food and music and dancing. Martha danced with Xavier, letting him lead her through the steps, her hand in his, her heart full to bursting. That night, back at the ranch with the children asleep in their rooms, Xavier and Martha sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The desert was quiet except for the usual night sounds, the wind and the coyotes and the rustle of small creatures in the brush. "Do you remember what I said to you the first time we met?" Xavier asked. Martha nodded. She remembered everything about that day. "I said your silence does not change that you are here, and it does not change that I need help on my ranch. I was wrong about that." Martha looked at him, confused and a little hurt. "I was wrong," Xavier continued, "because your silence has not been something to overlook or work around. It has been a gift. It has taught me to pay attention, to watch and listen in ways I never did before. It has shown me that communication is about so much more than words. You have made me a better man, Martha. A better husband, a better father, a better neighbor. And I would not change a single thing about you." Martha touched his face, her hand gentle against his sun-weathered cheek. Then she wrote on her slate by the light of the lantern, "You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have. You loved me not despite my silence, but with it, as part of who I am. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built a life and a love that transcended words. By 1895, Samuel was 12 and already helping to run the ranch in earnest. He had his father's natural leadership and his mother's careful attention to detail. Rose, now 9, was becoming known throughout the area for her beautiful preserves and the flowers she grew that seemed to bloom even in the harshest conditions. Both children were fluent in their mother's language of gestures and expressions, and they defended her fiercely if anyone ever suggested her muteness was a limitation. Xavier was now 41, his hair showing gray at the temples, but he was still strong and vital. Martha was 33, her hands work roughened but capable, her face showing the lines of a life lived under the desert sun. They had weathered droughts and floods, good years and lean years, illness and health. Through it all, their partnership had only grown stronger. One spring morning, Martha woke feeling ill. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, but as the days passed and the sickness continued, she began to suspect the truth. When the doctor from Quartzsite confirmed that she was pregnant again at 33, Martha was both thrilled and anxious. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two, leaving her weak and exhausted. Xavier was worried, hovering over her constantly, insisting she rest while he took over her chores. Samuel and Rose stepped up too, with Samuel helping his father with the ranch work, and Rose managing the house with surprising competence for a 9-year-old. "Ma, do not worry about anything," Rose said, bringing Martha a cup of tea. "I can handle the cooking and cleaning. You just focus on staying healthy." Martha was touched by her daughter's maturity and strength. She wrote, "You are growing up to be an amazing young woman." "I am learning from the best," Rose said simply, kissing her mother's cheek. The pregnancy progressed slowly through the summer and into the fall. By October, Martha was huge and uncomfortable, barely able to move. Xavier had brought in Mrs. Henderson and another neighbor woman to help, refusing to let Martha do anything but rest. On a cool November evening in 1895, Martha went into labor. This time the birth was more difficult, lasting nearly 24 hours. The doctor stayed at the ranch, monitoring her progress, looking increasingly worried as the hours stretched on. "The baby is breech," he finally told Xavier. "I am going to have to turn it and it will be painful, but it is the only way." Xavier held Martha's hand while the doctor worked, talking to her constantly, trying to distract her from the pain. Martha squeezed his hand so hard she thought she might break his fingers, but he never complained, never left her side. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the baby came. But instead of the lusty cry Martha expected, there was silence. Terrible, frightening silence. "The baby is not breathing," the doctor said, his voice urgent. Martha could not see what was happening, could not ask questions, could only lie there in terror while the doctor worked. Then, after what felt like forever, she heard it, a thin, reedy cry that grew stronger by the second. "There we go," the doctor said, relief evident in his voice. "Little fighter, this one." He brought the baby to Martha, and she saw she had another daughter, smaller than her other children had been, but with strong lungs now that she had started breathing. Martha held her new daughter and cried silently, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. "What will we name her?" Xavier asked, his own eyes wet. Martha thought for a moment, then wrote, "Hope, because we hoped for her and she fought to stay with us." "Hope Preston," Xavier said, smiling through his tears. "That is perfect." Samuel and Rose were allowed in to meet their new sister, both of them awed by how tiny she was. Samuel, now a nearly grown boy of 12, held Hope with surprising gentleness, his young face serious. "I will protect her," he said solemnly. "Always." Rose touched the baby's tiny hand. "She is beautiful, Ma, just like you." Recovery from Hope's birth was slow. The difficult labor had taken a toll on Martha's body, and the doctor warned that another pregnancy would be dangerous. Martha and Xavier accepted this, grateful for the 3 healthy children they had been blessed with. As Hope grew, it became clear she had inherited her mother's spirit along with her name. She was stubborn and determined, refusing to give up on anything once she set her mind to it. By the time she could walk, she was following Rose everywhere, trying to help in the garden despite being far too small to be useful. The ranch continued to prosper. Xavier's reputation for training excellent horses had spread throughout Arizona Territory and beyond. People came from as far away as California to buy horses from the Preston Ranch. With the income from the horses, Xavier was able to buy additional land and expand the cattle operation. Martha managed the business side of things, keeping meticulous records and handling correspondence with buyers. She had developed a system where Samuel or Xavier would read letters aloud to her, and she would write responses that they would then copy in their own handwriting. It worked well, and several of their regular customers had learned to recognize and appreciate Martha's direct, clear business style. In 1896, Arizona Territory was changing rapidly. The railroad had come through, bringing new settlers and new opportunities. Quartzsite, once a dusty crossroads, was becoming a proper town with brick buildings and paved streets. The school expanded, hiring new teachers and offering classes all the way through 8th grade. Martha insisted that all 3 children attend school, even though Samuel protested that he was needed on the ranch. "Education is important," Xavier told his son, reinforcing Martha's decision. "You may think you will be a rancher all your life, but you need to know how to read and write and do figures better than just barely. Your mother is proof that intelligence and education can overcome any obstacle." Samuel grumbled but obeyed, and soon he was excelling in his classes, particularly in mathematics. Rose loved reading and writing, bringing home books from the school library and reading them aloud to the family in the evenings. Even little Hope, not yet old enough for school, would sit and listen to the stories, her eyes wide with wonder. One afternoon in the spring of 1897, Martha was in the garden with Hope playing nearby when she saw a familiar figure riding up the road. Her heart seized with sudden fear. It was Cyrus Kane, looking older and somewhat diminished but still recognizable. She grabbed Hope and ran for the house, her slate forgotten in the garden. Xavier came running at her distress, his hand going immediately to his gun. "What is wrong?" Martha pointed at the approaching rider and Xavier's expression hardened. "Get inside with Hope. I will handle this." But Martha shook her head. She had faced Kane before and she would do so again. Whatever he wanted, they would deal with it together. She set Hope safely inside with firm instructions to stay put, then came back to stand beside Xavier. Kane pulled his horse to a stop and climbed down stiffly. He looked tired and defeated, nothing like the arrogant man who had threatened them years ago. "I am not here to cause trouble," Kane said, holding up his hands to show they were empty. "I am here to apologize." Xavier stared at him. "Apologize? I did a lot of things I am not proud of, Preston. A lot of things that came back to haunt me. After I left Arizona, I tried to set up in California, but my reputation had preceded me. Nobody would do business with me. I lost everything, ended up working as a common ranch hand. It gave me time to think, to realize what a fool I had been. And now? Xavier asked, his voice still hard with suspicion. Now I am dying. Consumption. Doctor gives me maybe 6 months. I wanted to make amends while I still could. Kane looked at Martha. I especially wanted to apologize to you, Mrs. Preston. The way I spoke about you that day, the threats I made, it was shameful. You are a good woman, and you deserved better than that. Martha studied his face, looking for signs of deception. But all she saw was genuine regret and the gray pallor of serious illness. She went into the house and returned with her slate. She wrote, I forgive you. Life is too short for grudges. Kane read the words and his eyes grew wet. Thank you. That is more than I deserve. He turned to Xavier. I do not expect your forgiveness, Preston. I just wanted you to know I was wrong about everything. You have built something good here, something that lasts. That is worth more than all the land in the territory. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, then he extended his hand. I forgive you too, Kane. Go in peace. Kane shook his hand, climbed back on his horse and rode away. They never saw him again, but months later they heard he had died in a hospital in Tucson, having donated what little money he had left to the church. That took courage, Xavier said to Martha, forgiving him like that. Martha wrote, holding on to anger only hurts us, letting it go sets us free. You are wiser than me, Xavier said, pulling her into his arms. You always have been. As the century drew to a close, the Preston family was firmly established as one of the most respected in the area. Their ranch was prosperous, their children were thriving, and their marriage was stronger than ever. Martha had become something of a local legend, the mute woman who ran a successful ranch, raised 3 children, and showed everyone that disability was no barrier to living a full and meaningful life. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1902, the town of Quartzsite threw them a celebration. The whole community turned out to honor the couple who had become the heart of their small corner of Arizona. There were speeches and toasts, and several people spoke about how Martha and Xavier's partnership had inspired them. The schoolteacher, a young woman from back east, stood up to speak. When I first came here, I confess I did not understand how Mrs. Preston could manage without speech. I thought it must be such a limitation, such a tragedy, but I was wrong. Mrs. Preston has shown me that communication is about so much more than words. She listens with her whole being. She observes. She thinks before she responds. In a world where everyone is so quick to speak, she reminds us of the value of silence and thoughtful consideration. She is an inspiration to my students and to me. Martha blushed at the praise, but Xavier squeezed her hand proudly. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and pulled Martha to her feet beside him. 20 years ago, Xavier said, I was a lonely man running a struggling ranch. I sent for a mail-order bride, expecting a simple arrangement, a transaction. What I got was a miracle. Martha came all this way not knowing what she would find, not knowing if I would accept her once I learned she could not speak. But she came anyway, and in doing so, she changed my life completely. He turned to face her directly. Martha, you have taught me that love is not about grand words or flowery speeches. It is about showing up every day, working side by side, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good ones. It is about building something together that neither of us could have built alone. Your silence does speak louder than any words. It speaks of strength and dignity and unwavering love. I am so proud to be your husband, and I thank God every day that you stepped off that stagecoach in Quartzsite 20 years ago." The crowd erupted in applause, and Martha found herself surrounded by well-wishers, all of them wanting to shake her hand or hug her, or simply tell her how much she meant to them. It was overwhelming but also deeply touching. She had come to this place an outsider, and now she was woven into the very fabric of the community. That night, lying in bed with Xavier's arms around her, Martha thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the fear she had felt stepping off that stagecoach, the uncertainty, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange man would give her a chance. She thought about how Xavier had looked at her and seen past her disability to the person beneath. She thought about the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the love they had nurtured through 20 years of marriage. Xavier stirred beside her. "Are you awake?" Martha nodded against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" She reached for her slate, which she still kept beside the bed, and wrote by the light of the moon coming through the window. "I am thinking about how lucky I am, how blessed, how grateful." "I am the lucky one," Xavier said, reading her words. "You made me a better man. You made this house a home. You gave me children and love and purpose. I could not ask for more." Martha kissed him, a long, sweet kiss full of 20 years of shared history and the promise of more years to come. When they finally pulled apart, Xavier smiled at her in the darkness. "I love you, Martha Preston. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Martha could not say the words back, but she did not need to. Xavier knew. He had always known. Her love was in every meal she cooked, every shirt she mended, every time she stood beside him in the face of trouble. Her love was in the way she had given him 3 beautiful children, in the way she managed their home and their business, in the way she looked at him every single day as if he was the most important person in the world. Her silence did speak louder than any words. It spoke of a love that was patient and kind, that endured all things, that never failed. And that was enough. It had always been enough. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as all lives do. Samuel grew into a fine young man and fell in love with a schoolteacher from Prescott, bringing her home as his bride when he was 22. Martha welcomed her daughter-in-law warmly, teaching her the ways of the ranch and helping her adjust to desert life. Rose, beautiful and accomplished, became a teacher herself, taking a position at the school in Quartzsite. She never married, telling her mother that she was perfectly happy with her life of books and students and her garden. Martha understood, knowing that not everyone needed marriage to find fulfillment. Hope, true to her name, grew into a spirited young woman who wanted to study medicine. It was an unusual ambition for a woman in 1907, but Martha supported her daughter completely. Xavier arranged for Hope to attend a women's medical college in California, and though it broke Martha's heart to see her youngest leave, she was immensely proud. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's capable management, with Xavier gradually stepping back and letting his son take on more responsibility. Xavier was now in his 50s, still strong but no longer young, and he was content to spend more time with Martha, working on smaller projects and enjoying the fruits of their decades of labor. In the spring of 1910, Martha and Xavier celebrated their 28th anniversary quietly, with just their family gathered around the table. Samuel and his wife had given them 2 grandchildren, boys who ran wild on the ranch and climbed into Martha's lap for stories that Rose or Samuel would read aloud. Rose brought flowers from her garden, and Hope sent a long letter from California describing her studies. After dinner, Xavier took Martha out to the porch, to the spot where they had sat so many evenings over the years. The desert was blooming with spring wildflowers, and the setting sun painted everything gold. "You remember the first time we sat here together?" Xavier asked. Martha nodded, smiling. How could she forget? She had been so uncertain, so afraid he would regret choosing her. I knew that night that I had made the right choice, Xavier said. The way you looked at the sunset, the peace on your face. I could see that you understood this land, that you were strong enough to build a life here. And I was right. You have been everything I could have hoped for and so much more. Martha leaned against his shoulder, content. She thought about writing something on her slate, but sometimes even that was not necessary. Sometimes sitting together in comfortable silence was enough, with the person who knew you better than anyone, who had walked beside you through nearly 3 decades of life. They sat that way until the stars came out. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had proven that love did not require words to be deep and true and lasting. Martha had come west as a mail-order bride, a mute woman taking a chance on an unknown future. She had found a home, a family, a love that transcended any limitation. Her silence had never been a weakness. It had been her strength, teaching her to observe and listen, to communicate in ways that went deeper than words. And Xavier had been wise enough to see that from the very beginning, to value what she could give rather than mourn what she could not. As they finally went inside, hand in hand, Martha knew that whatever time they had left together would be precious. They had built something beautiful in this harsh desert land, something that would endure long after they were gone. Their children carried on their legacy, and their grandchildren would too. The Preston Ranch stood solid under the Arizona stars, a testament to what two people could build together when they saw past surface differences to the heart beneath. And at the center of it all was a love that had started with a leap of faith and grown into something extraordinary. Martha's last thought before sleep claimed her was simple and profound. She had been truly blessed. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her people. And she had found a man who understood that her silence spoke louder than any words ever could, who had loved her not despite it but with it, as an integral part of who she was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In 1920, Martha and Xavier celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 60s now, their hair silver, their faces deeply lined by years of desert sun and hard work. But their love had only grown deeper with time, refined and strengthened by everything they had weathered together. The ranch was firmly in Samuel's hands now, with his 2 sons learning the business just as he had. Rose still taught in Quartzsite, beloved by generations of students. And Hope had returned from California as Dr. Hope Preston, setting up practice in town and becoming one of the few female doctors in the territory. Martha's health began to decline that year, her heart growing weak. She spent more time resting, letting others take over the work she had done for so long. But she never complained, facing this final challenge with the same quiet strength she had brought to everything else in her life. Xavier rarely left her side, reading to her, holding her hand, reminiscing about their years together. They talked about the day they met, about the children they had raised, about the life they had built from nothing. One evening in late autumn, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Martha suddenly reached for her slate. She wrote slowly, her hand shaky. "Thank you for seeing me when others only saw what I lacked. Thank you for loving me completely. Thank you for this beautiful life." Xavier read the words through his tears. "Thank you for choosing me, for staying even when things were hard, for making me the happiest man alive. I love you, Martha. I will always love you." Martha smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat that way as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to appear. One last peaceful evening together. Martha passed away quietly in her sleep that night, with Xavier holding her hand. She was 62 years old and had lived a life fuller and richer than she had ever imagined possible when she boarded that stagecoach to Arizona 38 years before. The entire community mourned her loss. The funeral was held in the church that had been built since her arrival, and it was packed with people whose lives she had touched. Ranchers she had helped, children she had taught to read, neighbors she had supported through hard times. They all came to pay respects to the remarkable woman who had shown them that strength came in many forms. Xavier lived for 5 more years, staying active on the ranch and spending time with his children and grandchildren. But everyone could see that part of him had died with Martha. He spoke often of her, telling stories to his grandchildren about how she had transformed his life, how her silence had taught him to truly listen, how her love had made him whole. On a spring morning in 1925, Xavier died peacefully in the bedroom he had shared with Martha for so many years. His last words were, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They buried him beside Martha in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstones were simple but bore inscriptions that told their story. Martha Delaney Preston, 1858–1920. Her silence spoke louder than any words. Xavier Preston, 1854–1925. He listened with his heart. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down through Samuel's line. But everyone who lived there remembered the story of Xavier and Martha, the mail-order bride who could not speak, and the cowboy who loved her anyway. Their story became legend in Quartzsite, a reminder that true love transcends all barriers, that disability is no obstacle to living fully, and that sometimes the most profound communication happens without words at all. Rose lived to be 90, dying in 1977, still teaching until the very end. Before she passed, she wrote down everything she remembered about her mother, creating a memoir that would be treasured by future generations. Hope practiced medicine until she was 70, helping countless patients in Quartzsite and the surrounding area. Both women credited their mother's example with giving them the courage to pursue their own paths. The Preston Ranch still stands today, though it has been transformed into a museum dedicated to telling the story of early Arizona ranching. In the main room hangs a portrait of Martha and Xavier, painted from an old photograph. Martha sits with her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene and strong. Xavier stands behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his face showing clearly the love and pride he felt for his remarkable wife. Visitors to the museum can see Martha's slate, carefully preserved, along with the ledgers she kept in her neat handwriting. They can read the letters Xavier wrote to her over the years, always addressed to "My dearest Martha," always full of love and respect. They can walk through the house she made a home, see the garden she planted, touch the life she built with her own 2 hands. But more than the physical artifacts, what remains is the story itself. The story of a woman who refused to let disability define her, who traveled across a continent to start a new life, who found love in the most unexpected place. The story of a man who looked past society's prejudices to see the person beneath, who understood that silence could be as eloquent as speech, who loved completely and without reservation. It is a story that still inspires people today, more than a century after Martha stepped off that stagecoach in Quartzsite. It reminds us that love is about seeing and valuing each other for who we truly are, that communication goes far beyond words, and that the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Martha Delaney Preston may have been mute, but her legacy speaks volumes. It speaks of courage and determination, of love that transcends limitation, of a life well lived despite the obstacles. Her silence did indeed speak louder than any words, and it continues to speak to anyone who hears her story. In the end, that is perhaps the greatest testament to Martha's remarkable life. That a woman who could not speak with her voice has spoken to countless hearts across the years, inspiring them to see past surface differences to the extraordinary potential in every human being. She proved that how we communicate matters less than what we communicate, and what she communicated throughout her life was simple but profound. Love, strength, dignity, and an unshakable belief in the power of the human spirit. The desert wind still blows across the Arizona hills, where Martha and Xavier built their dreams. The spring they fought so hard to protect still flows clear and cold. And somewhere in that timeless landscape, in the very air and earth and sky, their love story endures, waiting to be discovered by new generations who need to be reminded that true love sees beyond all barriers, and that sometimes silence really does speak louder than any words.